Hello and welcome to Fortinac 8.3 Training, Session 7, Guest and Contractor Management. In this session, we will see how we can manage guests and contractors with our Fortinac solution. We're going to see how to build the different guests or contractor accounts, as well as how to delegate guest and contractor administration to individual sponsors. It all begins with an administrator. The administrator of the Fortinac has a few tasks they have to complete. First, they will need to create guest or contractor templates. So these templates are going to define the capabilities of the guest or contractor accounts that are created from those templates. Once the administrator has created those templates, we could then immediately begin leveraging those templates to create our guests and contractors. However, the administrator could also choose to create what we call a sponsor, which is another admin user that is limited to simply being able to create and manage guests. So this could be done through the creation of an administrative profile that limits that admin user to just those capabilities. And within that profile, we can designate which guest or contractor templates are available to that admin user or sponsor. Once the profile has been created, then the sponsor account can be created and assigned that profile. Now, of course, the administrator is going to need to make sure that the network is under enforcement, meaning we're no longer allowing unknown devices on. Otherwise, the guest or contractor wouldn't need an account. Now that sponsor can take on the task of creating those guest and contractor accounts, but only the ones that they've been given access to the appropriate template for, and they can manage those accounts as well. Now, when we use guest contractor services, there's two new types of user icons that will be displayed within the user view. So instead of just the network user, which was the person with the blue jacket that we saw previously in the user views, we now have a guest being represented by a notepad with a pencil and a contractor being represented by a briefcase. These will act just like the other user accounts, meaning that as these guests and contractors onboard their devices, those devices will appear below the notepad or the briefcase. There's 5 different ways guest accounts can be created with the Fortinac. The first off is the individual account. So this is a one-off. This would normally be, say, someone at the front desk in the lobby can simply create a single account for a user that needs access. We have a bulk option where the sponsor can enter comma-separated information and one account per line to create a many all at one time. They can also import a CSV file and create a bulk number of accounts in that way. There's the conference option where the sponsor really initiates the creation of these conference accounts by giving the conference a name and a start and end time and designating how many accounts they need, but then the Fortinac builds all of those accounts. There's the self-registered guest. Now, the self-registered guest is really offloading the account creation to the guest themselves, where the guest will connect to an OpenSSID, for example, and be captive portaled and have to fill in the appropriate information for the account to be created. We can have this type of account automatically approved by the Fortinac or require a sponsor to approve or deny each account that's created by a guest. And the kiosk mode is a dedicated workstation, normally in a semi-public area like a front lobby, where a individual needing guest access could be directed to that specific machine where they could then go in and create an account on that kiosk. So here we're going to go through each of the steps in order. And we're going to begin with the creation of the guest and contractor template. So under the user menu, we've selected guest contractor templates. and there's some templates by default in the system, and we can use the add button at the bottom to create a new template. The new template has a couple of different tabs, the first tab being the required fields. Here we give the template a name, in this case standard guest, and select a visitor type. This could be guest, could be contractor, could be self-registered guest. And then we can have a role assigned to any account created from this template. And that role could be either the template name itself, standard guest, or we could select an existing role. These role values that are associated or a part of any account created from this template give us a means to leverage endpoint compliance or network access policies by keying upon that value in the creation of our user host profiles, like we saw in the policy session. We can also set a security and access value, and this value will be part of any account created from it. So again, this can be leveraged using policies. We can key upon those values. The username format is always email, and we can choose to send the account created information to the end user via email or via an SMS message. We set the password length, and this is exactly how long the password will be, and we have the ability to exclude certain characters so that when the Fortinac auto creates that password, it can be limited to what it's allowed to use. So if you use the mobile-friendly exclusions, which are in there by default or can be repopulated with the use of the button to the right, we're limiting the Fortinac to just numbers and letters. And this can often make the end user experience easier when they're trying to enter their password. We can designate a re-authentication period. So if we put 4 hours there, it means every 4 hours, the host will be isolated and need to re-enter their credentials. Our authentication method can be local, which is the default, because normally we're going to be building guest accounts that exist here within the Fortinac database, not necessarily in LDAP, for example. But we do have the option that we could use LDAP or Radius as our authentication methods. And then we can set our account duration. And that is the time the account will exist. At the end of that time, so in this case 12 hours from the account creation, that account will be deleted and that user will no longer have access. We can choose a login availability as well. So if we want our guests, for example, to only be allowed on the environment or on our network between, say, 7 a.m. and 6 p.m., we can Monday through Friday, we can designate that there. We can also enter an acceptable use policy if we want to have them accept that before gaining access. Our data fields are just the fields that need to be entered for the account to be created. This information will be entered either by the sponsor or by the guests themselves in the case of a self-registered guest or a kiosk. And we have 3 choices for each of these fields. We can do required. You'll see there that email is always required. That's the username. But we can require any of these fields, and that just means that the account will not be created until all required fields are filled in. We can ignore fields, which means they don't even show up, so the end user or the sponsor won't even see those fields when they're creating the account. And we can also have an optional setting. And when you select optional, the field will appear, but the Fortinac will allow you to create the account even if the optional fields are not filled in. There's also a note tab so that you can add any note information about this particular template. So once we've created our template, now let's go create our admin user, that special admin user that's just going to be a sponsor and be able to create guest accounts. So I've gone under my user menu, and from the user menu, I have selected the admin profiles option, and we've seen these in a previous session. And I can select to create a new admin profile with the add button. And here we're going to give it the name, guest sponsor, 20-minute timeout. Always available for login, but we don't have to do that. We could say, hey, I only want my sponsor to be able to build and manage guest accounts during certain days of the week and certain times of the day. The manage hosts and ports isn't going to be relevant here because we're not going to give any permission beyond guest and contractor account management. I'm going to have the associated admin users never expire so that we don't have to worry about them having to rebuild our admin accounts. I am not going to grant full permissions for these users because I want, when an upgrade occurs, I want to limit them just to guest contractor, and I want it to stay that way. And if we check the enable kiosk, that means this type of sponsor can really just open up the kiosk guest type. So they could open up that designated machine. They could log into it in the lobby, for example, and then users could use, guests could use that to create their own accounts. So we're going to create a sponsor here that is not a kiosk sponsor. And when we go under our permissions, we're going to be able to select which permission sets are going to define the capabilities of this sponsor. And we're only going to do one, guest contractor accounts. As you see, I've checked that as the access, but I have also checked a box over to the right in the custom column. These are the only things I'm going to select for this type of user. But by selecting that checkbox in the custom column, I've made the Manage Guests tab at the top appear. And this is going to give me access to give me the ability to define in a little more detail what the real capabilities of this sponsor are. So when I go to my Manage Guest tab, you'll see my guest account type access as the very first option, all accounts. That means this sponsor or any sponsor with this profile is going to be able to manage, meaning enable, disable, reset passwords for all my guest or contractor accounts. I could also, from that drop down, limit these sponsors to only the accounts they created, or I could deny any type of guest or contractor management by selecting the none option from the drop down. Now I can choose what type of accounts these admin users will be able to create, individual, bulk, or conference. I've selected all three. How far in advance they're allowed to create an account, and how long the account can exist. So the maximum duration of the guest account. And then under the allowed templates, here's really where my power as the administrator lies, where I can define what types of guest and contractors this sponsor is going to have the ability to create. And I've moved over to the right, just standard guest. So this type of sponsor cannot create an accounting contractor account. They can't create an engineering contractor account or anything else on the left side. They can only build the selected one on the right in the selected templates field, which is the standard guest. So now to create the accounts, I'm under the user menu, guest contractor accounts. You see there are none there at the moment. I could then use the add button to begin creating accounts. So here we see what a single account would look like. I choose the template, standard guest in this case, and then I fill in the required information at the top, which is the email, and then we see the password. We can regenerate, but the password's auto-generated. We designate the account start and end time. And then in the bottom portion is all the different fields that were required by the standard guest template. So I can go in and select and fill in all that required information and hit OK, and the account will be created. Bulk accounts are one account per line. Information is comma separated. And the format is right there on the screen just above the field where you enter the accounts. Or we can, just below the account field, we can import from a file. So if we have a pre-existing CSV file with accounts in it, we can bring them in here as well. And we have our account start date and our account end date. And all of these different accounts will share the same start and end. And we can use the Fortinet to create a conference account or a group of conference accounts. So in this example, we've selected the template is just called conference in this case, and we have a conference type. We can either do individual username, individual passwords. We can do individual usernames and shared passwords, or we can do shared username and shared password. Then we give the conference a name, and then the number of attendees. And you'll see there's a maximum designation to the right of the number of attendees field. That number, 50 in this case, is designated in the template. So when you create a guest template like we saw we could create, a conference one is a little bit different. It's only different as far as it's got one additional field, which is how many as the maximum accounts that can be created from that template. So the maximum here I set in the template was 50. We're going to create 45. Now under I designate my conference start date, my conference end date, and then when we hit OK here, the Fortinac is going to auto-generate those 45 accounts. Now if we go under our user menu and go to our guest contractor accounts, we're going to see all the guest and contractor accounts that exist, as well as have the ability to modify, delete, view details on any account, reset a password. And there's also a link in the upper left where we on the screen where we can view a report, and this is going to be a guest contractor report. So what we see here is whether the account is enabled, and then the second column is the sponsor. So who created this account? So M. Smith created an account of type guest, and they made the account for Jonathan Taylor. We see the user's email and all the information about the account that was created. Then below that, we see S. Jones created a guest account as well for Robert Tanner, and we have all the information about that account. And then the admin user created a group of conference accounts. So you see there's 45. You can see under the name column, we see Fortinac Security 45, Fortinac Security 44, because we created 45 unique accounts. So the accounts were auto-named. Each username was automatically created as the name of the conference dash the number, the account number. So that list will go all the way down to Fortinac Security-1. Now let's take a look at the process involved with guest self-registration. So this would normally be done with an open SSID, a guest SSID that anyone can connect to. And then as hosts connect to that are unknown, they will be isolated by the Fortinac, so they'll be placed into a captive portal. And within that captive portal, you have the self-registration portal access. So here you would normally have an acceptable use policy that the guest can accept, and then we have a guest contractor template that's attached to this process, and then the guests themselves fill in all the required information to build their own account. Now what happens next once they create or finish creating the account and submit it is there's two possible ways we can handle that account. First, we can have that account request sent off to a sponsor, and that sponsor can approve or deny the guest request. Or we can have the Fortinac automatically approve the guest account. That is the default. So by default, the account is automatically created and approved. But it's a very simple process to go and turn on the sponsor approval requirement. So let's take a look at how we configure the self-registration. This is done through the portal configuration. So I've gone under my system menu here and selected portal configuration. This could also be done as part of a portal policy. So you see here on the bottom left above the apply button, I've created a new portal page called self-registered guest. And I created this new page because I only want to give these guests one option for onboarding, and that's to create their own self-registration. So we check that box there, and I've unselected all of the other options that would be available to this guest. Then what we would need to do is on the left side in the Content Editor tab, underneath the registration branch, I go down to my self-registration login. And here's where I can set up the particulars of the self-registration portal page. I can put the text in that I want on the right-hand side. And you'll see down about halfway there is a default sponsor email. This is where I can enter 1, more than 1, comma separated, or 0 default sponsors. So if I leave that field blank, the user that's requesting access will have a field on the onboarding page asking them to supply their sponsor's email. Now, only admins with accounts in the Fortinac will have the ability to approve a request. If I put a single email address there, then what I'm going to get is that one individual will get all requests. and they will have to approve or deny them. Or I could comma separate and put a bunch in there, and then all those sponsors would get emails every time there's a request, and the first sponsor to respond wins. So if someone denies and then someone else accepts, the deny is going to take precedence because it went first. Then you can see there's a checkbox there that we can notify the sponsor of the guest details. That just means the request email that's sent to the sponsor contains all the information the guest was required to enter into the portal page. If we go a little further down, there's a require sponsor approval checkbox. This is off by default. So when that is not checked, it means every request is automatically approved and the account is active. If we check that box, then the user will submit, and you'll see just below that checkbox, guest request expiration, there's a 20-minute expiration time. So if no sponsor responds within 20 minutes, then the guest will be brought back to the form and be required to fill it out again and submit again for guest access. If we scroll to the bottom of this screen, we see we have some additional options here. The sponsor approval link requires login. So you see that first checkbox. So that would require the sponsor to supply valid Fortinet credentials in order to approve. And then down a little further, there's a whole row of checkboxes. We have notify user via portal page. That means when they're approved, their captive portal page will refresh and tell them that they've been approved. And you'll see right below that, that checkbox is another one that says show password and portal page notification. So what that does is says they're approved, and it gives them the login page with their username and password pre-populated for them, so that it's very simple. They just have to hit submit and they get onto the network. So that's an end user experience type of thing. It gives them a much easier onboarding instead of having to write down their username and password or something like that. It's already pre-populated. We can notify the user with email or SMS as well. We designate our default template. So this is the guest contractor template that will be applied to any account created through this portal. And then we have our acceptable use policy. And we can set that up right here and just paste in into these fields and what we want them to agree to before they're allowed to create their account. And that concludes this session.